You think you know what heartbreak is? Try traveling 800 miles to marry a man you've only ever met in letters, a man who promised you a home and a family, only to find an empty farmhouse. Empty except for the 6 children staring at you from the porch. His children. And he's nowhere to be found. That was me, Margaret Sullivan, standing in a dusty Iowa farmyard in September of 1888. My best traveling dress, the one that cost me a month's wages, felt like a costume for a play that had just been canceled. The air smelled of wood smoke and dying leaves, and the only sound was the whimpering of a baby from inside the house. 6 pairs of eyes were fixed on me. They weren't just curious. They were hungry. They were scared. They were old eyes and young faces. The oldest, a boy of about 12, stood in front of the others like a small, fierce general protecting his last line of defense. His knuckles were white where he gripped the porch railing. "Who are you?" he asked, and his voice was rough, like he hadn't used it much for talking, only for shouting orders. I'm Margaret," I said, my own voice a stranger in my ears. "I'm a friend of your father's, Samuel Henderson. He was supposed to meet my train." The boy's face didn't change. "He ain't here." That much was obvious. The farm had a feeling of abandonment. Weeds were starting to reclaim the vegetable garden. A line of laundry hung limp and gray, forgotten for days. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, like a held breath. I had spent 3 days on a train, dreaming of this moment. I'd pictured Samuel, the man with the kind handwriting, greeting me with a warm smile. I'd pictured these children, his children, shyly welcoming the new mother they so desperately needed. In his letters, he'd painted a picture of a bustling, happy home. What I found was a ghost ship crewed by orphans. "Where is he?" I asked, my heart starting to pound a slow, heavy drum beat against my ribs. "Did he have to go to town? Is there an emergency?" The boy, James, just stared at me. He didn't answer. Behind him, a little girl of about 10, Emma, shifted the crying baby on her hip. The baby, Lucy, couldn't have been more than 8 months old. Her cries were weak, tired. This wasn't right. Something was terribly wrong. I had Samuel's last letter in my reticule, the ink still crisp. "I count the days until your arrival," he'd written. "The children and I are buzzing with anticipation." That letter was 3 weeks old. The plan in my head, the future I had bet my entire life on, was crumbling into dust. But I couldn't just stand there. I took a step toward the porch. "May I come in? Perhaps I can help with the baby." James didn't move. He was a statue of defiance. "We don't need help." But the baby's cries said otherwise, and so did the haunted look in his sister's eyes. I took another step. I wasn't a governess anymore, taking orders in someone else's house. I didn't know what I was, but I knew I couldn't turn my back on this. Just as I reached the bottom step, a wagon rattled up the lane. A woman, her face etched with worry, pulled the horse to a stop. She was carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "James!" she called out, her voice a mix of relief and concern. "Thank heavens! I was so worried when you didn't come for the milk." She climbed down from the wagon, and her eyes fell on me, standing there with my traveling satchel in the dirt. Her expression changed. The worry lines around her eyes deepened into something else. Pity. She looked from my fine dress to the 6 silent children on the porch, then back to me. She knew who I was, and she knew something I didn't. "Oh, you poor dear," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You must be Margaret. Nobody told you?" The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. James looked at the ground. Emma hugged the baby tighter. The woman who introduced herself as Martha Wilson from the next farm over took a deep breath. She placed a gentle hand on my arm, and her touch was like a spark on dry tinder, making my whole body tremble. "My dear," she said, and the words fell like stones into a deep, dark well. "Samuel, he's gone. He passed away. Nearly a month ago now." The world tilted on its axis. The sun seemed to dim. Samuel was dead. The man I had traveled across a continent to marry, the father of these children, the architect of my future, was gone. But as the initial shock washed over me, a cold, sharp question cut through the fog. If he'd been gone a month, why was his last letter to me, filled with hope and excitement, only 3 weeks old. The dates didn't add up. Martha Wilson's news hit me like a physical blow. Samuel dead. For a month. I gripped the porch railing to keep from collapsing, the rough wood digging into my palms. My mind was a whirlwind of canceled dreams and terrifying questions. How? I whispered, the words scraping my throat raw. A fever, Martha said, her eyes full of genuine sorrow. It took him fast. One day he was strong as an ox. 3 days later, he was gone. The whole community was shocked. He left these poor babies all alone. She looked at the children, her expression softening. We've been doing what we can, bringing food, checking in. But James here, he's so proud. He's been trying to keep it all together, pretending everything's fine. He was scared the county would find out and split them up. It all clicked into place. Their silence. The fierce, desperate look in James's eyes. They hadn't been surviving. They'd been hiding. A 12-year-old boy trying to outsmart the world to keep his family together. My heart broke for him, for all of them. That night I stayed with Martha and her husband, Tom. I lay awake in their spare room, staring into the darkness. The faces of those 6 children burned into my mind. I had come to Iowa to be a wife and mother. Now the husband was gone, but the children remained, and they were in more trouble than anyone knew. The next morning, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't just turn around and go back to Philadelphia. I couldn't leave them to their fate. Tom Wilson drove me back to the Henderson farm. This time, when I stepped out of the wagon, I wasn't a hopeful bride-to-be. I was something else. A rescuer, maybe, or just a woman who couldn't walk away. I spent the day with them, and what I saw was a portrait of desperate, courageous survival. Emma, just 10 years old, trying to cook meals from dwindling supplies, trying to wash clothes in a heavy tub, trying to soothe a baby whose needs she couldn't fully understand. The 8-year-old twins, William and Walter, were trying to manage the farm chores, their small bodies straining with work meant for a grown man. Little Sarah, 6, and Henry, 4, were quiet as ghosts clinging to each other, their eyes wide with a fear they couldn't name. I rolled up my sleeves and got to work. I showed Emma how to properly mix the baby's milk. I organized the kitchen. I helped the boys mend a fence on the chicken coop. And slowly, so slowly, the wall of suspicion around them began to crack. But as I worked, cleaning the chaotic farmhouse, I listened. Martha had said the fever was fast, but when I talked to James, trying to get him to open up, his story had holes. Papa got a headache, he said, his eyes fixed on the floor. Then he got hot, real hot. He told us to stay away so we wouldn't get sick. He shut himself in his room. Did Dr. Richardson come? I asked gently. He shook his head. There wasn't time. It was so fast. Too fast. A man as strong as Samuel, felled in 3 days by a simple fever, without even a doctor's visit? It felt wrong. My years as a governess had taught me about childhood illnesses, about fevers that came and went. This sounded different. This sounded violent. That evening, after I'd finally gotten the little ones to sleep, I was sweeping out the main room. Under the edge of a heavy rug near Samuel's writing desk, my broom caught on a loose floorboard. Curiosity got the better of me. I knelt down and pried it up. Beneath it was a small, hidden space, and inside that space was a leather-bound journal. Samuel's journal. My hands trembled as I opened it. His handwriting, so familiar from his letters, filled the pages. I flipped to the last few entries. They weren't about preparing for my arrival. They weren't about the farm. They were about fear. His last entry was dated the day before he supposedly fell ill. The handwriting was jagged, frantic. Croft was here again. He knows I won't sell. He threatened me. Said if I didn't give him the stream rights, he'd see my family scattered to the winds and my farm turned to dust. He's a wicked man. I fear what he might do. I have to protect my children. Croft, Silas Croft. I recognized the name. He owned the neighboring property to the east. The Wilsons were on the west. According to Samuel's letters, there had been a long-standing, bitter dispute over the stream that marked their property line. Samuel wasn't just sick, he was threatened. And then I saw it. Tucked into the back pocket of the journal was a folded piece of paper. It wasn't a letter. It was a receipt from the Cedar Falls Bank. It was dated 2 days before his death. It was a withdrawal slip for $500, an enormous sum of money, enough to buy a whole new herd of cattle, or enough to make a man desperate. Why would Samuel withdraw that much cash right before he died? And where was the money now? The journal changed everything. Samuel's death was no longer just a tragedy, it was a mystery, and a dangerous one at that. Silas Croft. The threat. The $500. It was a dark and tangled knot, and I was standing right in the middle of it. The next day, I focused on bringing order to the house, but my mind was racing. I needed to know more about this Silas Croft. When Tom Wilson came by to check on us, I asked him, trying to sound casual. Tom's face darkened. Silas Croft is a man you'd do well to avoid, he said, his voice low. He's got a temper like a rattlesnake, and he's greedy. He's been trying to get his hands on Samuel's water rights for years. He believes that stream belongs to him, and he's not a man who takes no for an answer. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a neighborly squabble. Later that afternoon, as I was hanging fresh laundry on the line, the first clean clothes these children had worn in a month, I saw a figure on horseback approaching from the east, a big man on a big horse, moving with an arrogance that set my teeth on edge. It was Silas Croft. He didn't stop at the lane. He rode right into the farmyard, his horse tearing up the grass. The children who had been playing nearby scattered like frightened birds, running to hide behind my skirts. Croft dismounted. He was even more intimidating up close, a barrel-chested man with a thick, black beard and small, cold eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He ignored me completely and scanned the property, his gaze lingering on the barn, the livestock, the house. It wasn't a look of sympathy. It was a look of appraisal, like he was measuring drapes. "Heard about Sam," he said, his voice a low rumble. He finally looked at me, his eyes dismissing me as nothing more than a temporary inconvenience. Tragic. There was no sadness in his voice, only a cold, flat satisfaction. "I also heard," he continued, taking a step closer, "that he owed me a considerable sum of money before he passed. $500 to be exact." The number hit me like a stone, the exact amount from the bank receipt. "A debt," Croft said, a cruel smile twisting his lips, "that now falls to his estate, which means this farm." My heart hammered against my ribs. He was making a claim, a fraudulent claim, I was sure of it. This was his plan: threaten Samuel, maybe worse, and then seize the farm over a phantom debt. But then James, who had been standing beside me, silent and trembling, did something incredibly brave. "That's a lie," he whispered, his voice shaking but clear. Croft's cold eyes snapped down to the boy. "What did you say, boy?" "It's a lie," James repeated, louder this time. He took a small step forward. "Papa didn't owe you anything. He paid you. The day before he got sick. I saw it. He gave you the money right here in this yard." Croft's face contorted with rage. For a second, I thought he was going to strike the boy. "He paid you," James insisted, his courage growing, "and you gave him a receipt. And then you snatched it back from his hand and tore it into pieces. You said no one would ever believe a boy. A paid debt, a destroyed receipt. A boy is the only witness. It was Croft's word against a grieving child's. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, whose story the world would believe." Croft's smile returned, colder and more dangerous than before. "The boy's confused," he said, looking at me. "Grief does strange things to the mind. The debt stands, and I intend to collect." He mounted his horse, gave the farm one last, possessive look, and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and fear in his wake. I pulled James close. He was shaking uncontrollably now that the danger had passed. He had told the truth. I knew he had. Which meant Silas Croft wasn't just a greedy neighbor. He was a thief and a liar. And maybe something much worse. The air grew heavy with the unspoken truth. This wasn't just about a farm, it was about a crime. And my simple plan to help 6 orphans had just turned into a dangerous investigation. I had to protect these children, not just from poverty, but from the man who may have destroyed their family. That night, sleep was impossible. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. I had no legal standing here. I was a stranger, an outsider. Croft could come back at any time. And then, 2 days later, he did. But he wasn't alone. He came in a buggy, seated next to a thin, severe-looking man in a dark suit. The man carried a leather portfolio and had the cold, impartial air of a government official. "Miss Sullivan," the man said, stepping down from the buggy without waiting for an invitation. "I am Harrison Blake, the county supervisor, and I'm here to resolve the situation of these children." He didn't sound like he was here to help. He sounded like he was here to execute a sentence. He swept into the house, his eyes cataloging every detail. I had worked tirelessly to clean and organize, to create an atmosphere of care and stability, but he seemed determined to see only chaos. "This is an unacceptable arrangement," he declared, his voice devoid of any warmth. "An unmarried woman, a stranger, living in a house with 6 minor children. It is improper. It is unstable. The county cannot allow it." Silas Croft stood just behind him, a smug look on his face. This was his doing. He had brought the law down on us. "These children will be taken into the county's care," Blake announced, as if discussing livestock. "They will be placed in proper homes." "Together?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Blake gave a short, dismissive laugh. "Of course not. Finding a home for 6 children is an impossibility. They will be separated. The older boys can be placed with a farmer who needs hands. The girls with families who need domestic help. The infant will be sent to the orphanage in Des Moines." The words were a death sentence for this family. To tear them apart after everything they had endured. It was a cruelty I couldn't comprehend. Emma let out a small, choked sob and clutched baby Lucy tighter. James stood frozen, his face a mask of pale, helpless fury. "You can't," I said, finding my voice. "They've lost their parents. You can't take away the only family they have left." "I am not here to debate the matter, Miss Sullivan," Blake said coldly. "I am here to enforce procedure. My decision is final. I will return in 1 week with the paperwork and the placements." He turned to leave, his duty done. But as he stepped out the door, he paused and said something to Croft. Something I wasn't meant to hear, but I did. "It's a fine property, Silas," Blake said, his voice low. "Once it's unencumbered by dependents, your bid should go through without a problem." He glanced back at me, a flicker of triumph in his eyes. "After all," he added with a thin smile, "it's always good to keep things in the family. My brother-in-law deserves a bit of good fortune." Brother-in-law? The final piece of the puzzle clicked into its horrifying place. This wasn't procedure. It wasn't about the children's welfare. It was a conspiracy. A corrupt county official and his greedy brother-in-law working together to steal a dead man's farm and scatter his children to the wind. Just as Croft had threatened. They weren't just trying to take the farm. They were trying to erase the Henderson family from existence, and I was the only thing standing in their way. The revelation that Blake and Croft were related turned my fear into cold, hard resolve. I wasn't just fighting for 6 orphans anymore. I was fighting against a deep-seated corruption that threatened to swallow them whole. I had 1 week, 7 days to stop a legal train that was already barreling down the tracks. My first move was to seek allies. I went straight to Tom and Martha Wilson. When I explained what I had overheard, Tom's face grew grim. "I'm not surprised," he said, shaking his head. "Harrison Blake has always used his office for his own gain, and Croft is his muscle. People are afraid of them. They own the bank. They have the sheriff in their pocket. Challenging them is a dangerous game." "But there has to be a way," I insisted. "There's a judge, isn't there? A court?" "Judge Morrison," Martha said. "He's a fair man, an honest one. But he relies on the reports and recommendations of his county supervisor. He relies on Blake. To get to the judge, you'd need to go through Blake, and Blake will bury you in paperwork and procedure until it's too late." "Then we have to go around him," I said, a plan starting to form in my mind. "We need to build a case so strong, so public, that the judge can't ignore it. We need to win over the heart of this town." Tom nodded slowly. "It's a long shot. You'll need the most respected people in Cedar Falls to stand with you. People Blake can't intimidate." My first stop was the one person I thought might understand my fight. Dr. Emily Richardson. As the town's only female physician, she had fought her own battles against the establishment. I found her in her office above the pharmacy, a place of sharp smells and organized intellect. She listened to my story without interruption, her sharp eyes studying my face, weighing my words. I told her everything. The journal, the missing money, Croft's threats, Blake's corruption. When I finished, she was silent for a long time. I knew Samuel Henderson, she said finally. He was a good man, and you are right to be suspicious about his death. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Harrison Blake came to see me the day after Samuel died. He told me the family wanted to avoid the expense of a formal examination, that it was clearly a fever. He pressured me to sign the death certificate. My heart stopped. Did you see the body? Dr. Richardson shook her head, a flicker of guilt in her eyes. No, and I've regretted it ever since. I listed the cause of death as influenza, based on Blake's report. But Samuel was a healthy man. For it to take him in 3 days with no prior illness, it's medically unusual, highly unusual. This was it, a crack in their story. The official cause of death was a lie, or at least a guess, sanctioned by a corrupt official. Will you help me? I asked. A slow smile spread across her face. Miss Sullivan, I've been waiting for a chance to stand up to Harrison Blake for years. You have my full support and my testimony. With Dr. Richardson on my side, I felt a surge of hope. My next stop was Reverend O'Connor at the church. I knew Blake and Croft portrayed themselves as pious, church-going men. I needed to show the town's moral leader who the real sinners were. I brought the children with me. I wanted the Reverend to see them not as problems to be solved, but as a family to be saved. He listened patiently, his wife Catherine looking at the children with undisguised compassion. When I was done, he looked at James. Son, he said kindly, tell me about your father's faith. James, who had been silent, looked up. Papa taught us to be honest, he said, his voice clear and strong. He taught us that a man's land is his legacy, and his family is his treasure. He said God sees the truth, even when men try to hide it. The simple, powerful honesty in the boy's words did more than any argument I could have made. Reverend O'Connor placed a hand on James's shoulder. Miss Sullivan, he said to me, this Sunday I want you and your family sitting in the front pew of my church. It's time this community saw the truth for itself. The battle lines were being drawn. With the doctor and the Reverend on my side, Blake's carefully constructed narrative would begin to fall apart. But I knew it wasn't enough. I needed something more. I needed proof. I went back to the farm with a new sense of purpose. I had to find where the $500 went. I had to find out what really happened to Samuel. I searched his desk again, this time looking for anything out of place. Tucked away in a drawer full of old receipts was a small, pocket-sized train schedule. One route was circled in pencil. It was a train departing Cedar Falls for Des Moines. Scheduled for the afternoon of the day Samuel supposedly fell ill. He wasn't planning on getting sick. He was planning on going somewhere. I rode into town and went to the train station. The station agent was a crusty old man named Gus. At first, he was reluctant to talk. I don't recall, he said, not looking up from his paperwork. But then I mentioned Samuel Henderson's name, and his eyes flickered. Sam? He said. Yeah, I remember that day. He was here, seemed agitated, was arguing with Silas Croft right there on the platform. My pulse quickened. What were they arguing about? Money, Gus grunted. Always money with Croft. Sam told him he had what he was owed, but not for him. Said he was taking it to someone who could do some good with it. Croft got nasty, real nasty. This was huge. Samuel wasn't paying a debt to Croft. He was taking the money somewhere else. Did Samuel get on the train? I asked. Gus shook his head. Never did. The argument broke up. Croft stormed off. Sam looked worried. He paced around for a bit. Then he left. He was supposed to leave town, but something stopped him. The argument with Croft. Was there anyone else there? I pressed. Did you see anyone with them? Or watching them? Gus squinted, thinking back. You know, there was another fella, a stranger, dressed like he'd been traveling a long ways. Kept to himself, but I saw him watching Sam and Croft. When the train for Des Moines left, the stranger was on it. A stranger, watching them. It could be nothing, or it could be everything. That night back at the farm, I couldn't shake the image of the stranger from my mind. While the children slept, I went through Samuel's things one more time, searching for a clue I might have missed. In a trunk at the foot of his bed, beneath old wool blankets, I found a bundle of letters I hadn't seen before. They weren't from me. They were from Oregon. They were from his brother, Elias Henderson, the brother he'd mentioned in his first letter to me, the one he hadn't seen in over a decade. The letters were recent, filled with excitement. Elias had sold his claim in Oregon and was coming to Iowa. He was coming to invest his life savings and become a partner in the farm. My hands were shaking as I read the last letter. Dearest Samuel, I am on my way at last. Expect me around the 20th of September. I'm traveling light, but carrying my future in a money belt. It will be a grand reunion. Your loving brother, Elias. The 20th of September, the exact day Samuel had died. Elias was supposed to arrive the very day of the murder. He was carrying a large amount of cash, and no one had seen or heard from him. Then I read the postscript, and the world stopped turning. P.S. You won't recognize me. The years have been rugged. I've grown a beard and lost some hair. I'll be the tired-looking stranger getting off the train, hoping his brother still knows his face. The stranger at the station. It was Elias. He had arrived. He had seen the argument between his brother and Croft, and then he had vanished. Now I knew. Two brothers were missing, one dead, one vanished. Two large sums of money were gone, and Silas Croft and Harrison Blake were at the center of it all. This was so much bigger and darker than I had ever imagined. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture of pure evil. Elias arrived with his life savings. Samuel withdrew $500 for a mysterious purpose, and both brothers ended up dead or missing on the same day. Croft and Blake were behind it all, but proving it was another matter entirely. A dead man, a missing man, and a corrupt system. I felt a chilling thought creep into my mind. Where would you hide a body on a sprawling farm? The next morning, I told James I needed to inspect the property lines, especially the one bordering Croft's land. I needed his help. I didn't tell him what I was truly looking for. I couldn't bear to put that horror into his mind. We walked the eastern fence line, near the disputed stream. The area was thick with old apple trees, their branches heavy with unpicked fruit. It was quiet, secluded, the perfect place to hide a secret. As we walked, I scanned the ground, and then I saw it. Near an ancient gnarled oak tree, there was a patch of earth that was different. The grass was trampled, the soil freshly turned and then hastily covered with fallen leaves. It was about the size of a man. My blood turned to ice. This was it. James, I said, my voice tight, go back to the house, get the shovel from the barn. Don't ask why, just do it, and hurry. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a dawning fear, but he did as he was told. While he was gone, I knelt down, my hands shaking, and began pulling away the leaves. The earth beneath was soft, too soft. When James returned with the shovel, I took it from his trembling hands. Stand back, I told him. I plunged the shovel into the soft earth. It sank in easily. I dug, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the sick feeling in my stomach growing with every scoop of dirt. A few feet down, the shovel hit something solid, not a rock, wood. I cleared the dirt away and uncovered the top of a small, crudely made wooden crate. It wasn't a coffin. It was too small. With a final, wrenching effort, I pried the lid open. The smell of damp earth and decay hit me. Inside, there wasn't a body. It was Samuel Henderson's traveling satchel, and his wallet turned inside out and empty. And beneath that, a shirt, stiff and dark with a large, unmistakable bloodstain. This was where the attack happened. My eyes scanned the contents again. Tucked into a corner of the crate, half buried in the dirt, was another wallet. A worn leather billfold that wasn't Samuel's. With a trembling finger, I hooked it out. I opened it. Inside was a faded photograph of a young man who looked remarkably like Samuel, and a driver's license from the state of Oregon. The name on it was Elias Henderson. They had robbed them both. But where were the bodies? And what had Samuel been planning to do with that $500? He wasn't paying Croft. He was taking it to someone who could do some good with it. It was evidence money, bribe money, payment for a service. We covered the crate back up, my mind reeling. I had proof of a violent crime, but it still wasn't enough. It didn't directly link Croft and Blake to murder. I needed the final piece. That evening, I sat at Samuel's desk, the weight of the world on my shoulders. James sat with me, too shaken to sleep. He idly pulled open a small drawer we had overlooked, one filled with old seed catalogs and almanacs. "What's this?" he asked, pulling out a small, thin ledger book. I'd seen it before and dismissed it. It looked like farm accounts. But as James flipped through the pages, I saw that the numbers and entries made no sense. Sold 10 chickens for $300. Bought 2 bags of feed for $500. It was gibberish. Or was it? Suddenly, an old memory surfaced. My time as a governess for the wealthy Ashford family. I remembered teaching the children simple ciphers and codes for fun. A substitution cipher, where numbers stood for letters. A11, B2, C3. "James," I said, my voice electric with a new idea. "Get a piece of paper and a pencil." We worked feverishly, testing the theory. The numbers were a simple code. 1 through 26 corresponded to the letters of the alphabet. The nonsensical farm entries were not farm entries at all. They were a damning record of Harrison Blake's corruption. Samuel had been keeping a secret diary. Page after page detailed Blake using his office to extort local farmers, seize land on fraudulent claims, and enrich himself and his brother-in-law, Silas Croft. Samuel had been collecting evidence for months, building a case to take to the state authorities. Then we reached the final page, the last entry. My blood ran cold as I translated the numbers. Elias arrived with proof from Oregon. Blake ran a similar scheme there before he fled. We have him, taking the $500 to pay my source for the final signed affidavit. We meet at the old mill tonight. We'll take everything to the state marshal in the morning. Croft followed me from the bank. "I fear the worst. Pray for us." The old mill, that's where it happened. And the $500 was for the final piece of evidence against them. They hadn't just killed Samuel and Elias to steal their money. They had killed them to silence them. We had it. We had the proof. A detailed account of their crimes in the dead man's own hand. The court hearing was in 2 days. We had to get this ledger to someone in authority. Someone Blake couldn't control. Tom Wilson knew what to do. "The state marshal is holding court in Porter County," he said, his face grim. "It's a full day's ride from here, but he's the only one we can trust. I'll ride at dawn. You, Margaret, you have to go to that hearing. You have to stall. Do whatever it takes to keep Blake in that courtroom until I can get back with the marshal." It was a desperate, dangerous plan. The fate of these children, the justice for their father, it all came down to a race against time. The next morning, as Tom was saddling his fastest horse in the pre-dawn gloom, we heard the sound of riders approaching. Not one, but 3. Silas Croft and 2 of his brutish hired hands reined in their horses, blocking the end of the lane. They had been watching us. They knew we were up to something. Croft's cold eyes swept over us, lingering on Tom's saddled horse. A slow, ugly smile spread across his face. "Going somewhere, Wilson?" he sneered. He dismounted and walked toward the house, his men fanning out behind him. "Blake sent us," Croft said, his voice a low growl. "He was worried you all might get lost before the hearing. We're here to escort you, to make sure the children are ready for their trip in the morning." It wasn't an offer of help. It was a threat. We were trapped, prisoners in our own home, and the evidence that could bring them all down was hidden inside my dress, a ticking time bomb against my skin. The race against time had just become a siege. The sun rose on the longest day of my life. Croft and his men made themselves at home, their presence a suffocating poison in the air. They were searching for something. The ledger. They didn't say it, but their eyes were constantly scanning, probing. Croft knew Samuel had been digging into his affairs. He was here to find that proof and destroy it. I had to protect the children. I had to protect the ledger. And somehow Tom Wilson still had to get away. The tension was unbearable. The younger children huddled around me, their faces pale with terror. But the twins, William and Walter, had a spark of defiance in their eyes. They knew this house better than anyone. Its secret passages, its creaky floorboards, its hidden nooks. They came to me while Croft was ransacking the barn. "We can help," William whispered. "We know how to make noises." And so began a subtle campaign of guerrilla warfare. A sudden crash from the attic, sending one of Croft's men scrambling up the ladder to find nothing but a precariously balanced stack of old boxes. A strange moaning sound from the root cellar, which turned out to be the wind whistling through a loose board they'd known about for years. They were brilliant, distracting the men, fraying their nerves, keeping them chasing shadows. This was my chance. During the chaos, I slipped the ledger to James. "The old storm cellar," I whispered, my heart in my throat. "The entrance is hidden under the woodpile behind the smokehouse. Get to the Wilsons. Give this to Martha. Tell her to hide it. Tell her Tom has to ride. Now, James, run." He looked at me, his 12-year-old face set with the determination of a grown man. He nodded once, a silent promise passing between us. While the twins created a massive distraction by accidentally letting a pig loose in the vegetable garden, James slipped out the back. He was a shadow, moving through the tall grass towards the woods that separated their farm from the Wilsons. He almost made it, but from the hayloft of the barn, Croft saw the movement. With a roar of fury, he leaped down and gave chase. I watched in helpless horror as the big man bore down on the small boy. James ran with all his might, but it was no use. Croft caught him at the edge of the woods, grabbing him by the collar and shaking him like a rag doll. My blood ran cold. It was over. Croft dragged a sobbing, defeated James back to the house. "Looking for this?" he snarled, patting the boy down. But James's pockets were empty. Croft's face twisted in frustration. He didn't have the book. James hadn't run with it. He had stashed it in the storm cellar, just as I'd told him. He'd been a decoy. My brave, brilliant boy had sacrificed himself to protect the evidence. Croft didn't know that, but he knew the book was still out there, and he knew his time was running out. His crude search had failed. Now he would take us to his brother-in-law to the courthouse, where their corrupt version of the law would finish the job. The ride to the county seat was silent and terrifying. Croft drove the wagon, his men riding alongside like prison guards. He had James sitting next to him, a heavy hand on the boy's shoulder, a constant menacing reminder of who was in control. The courthouse was an imposing brick building, a place that was supposed to represent justice, but today felt like the gallows. We were herded inside. The courtroom was small, stuffy. Harrison Blake sat at his table, looking smug and impatient. He saw Croft and gave a slight, satisfied nod. Judge Morrison entered, a man with a reputation for fairness, but a man who was about to be presented with a mountain of lies. The proceedings began. Blake made his case, painting me as an unstable, meddling spinster and the children as neglected wards in desperate need of the county's care. His voice was smooth, confident, the picture of bureaucratic authority. Then it was my turn. I stood up, my legs trembling. I had to stall. I had to stretch every second into a minute, every minute into an eternity. I began to present my case for guardianship, the one I had prepared so meticulously. I spoke about Samuel's letters. I spoke about my qualifications as a governess. I spoke about the farm's finances, going into excruciating detail about crop yields and livestock prices. Blake shifted in his chair, annoyed. The judge listened patiently, but I could see him glancing at the clock. I was running out of time. Where was Tom? I talked about the children, describing each one's personality, their needs, their dreams. My voice broke as I spoke of their love for each other, of the cruelty of tearing them apart. Tears streamed down Emma's face. James stared at the floor, defeated. "This is all very touching, Miss Sullivan," Blake interrupted, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But it is not relevant. The law is clear. I ask the court to dismiss this petition and grant the county custody." The judge looked at me. "Miss Sullivan, do you have anything further to add?" My throat was dry. My time was up. I had failed. And then it happened. The heavy courtroom doors burst open with a crash that made everyone jump. Standing in the doorway, covered in dust and sweat, was Tom Wilson. Beside him stood a tall, grim-faced man with a silver star pinned to his vest, the state marshal. But they weren't alone. Leaning on the marshal's arm, looking pale and gaunt but very much alive, was a man with Samuel Henderson's eyes. Elias Henderson. The courtroom erupted in gasps. Blake's face went white as a sheet. Croft leaped to his feet, his hand instinctively going for a gun that wasn't there. "That man is an imposter!" Blake shouted, his voice cracking with panic. But it was too late. "He's no imposter," the marshal's voice boomed through the silent room. "This is Elias Henderson, and he has quite a story to tell. A story about an ambush at the old mill. A story about his brother's murder." Elias pointed a shaking finger at Croft. "That man and his thugs. They killed my brother. They beat me and left me for dead in the river. But they failed." "Lies!" Croft roared. "Is it?" the marshal said calmly, holding up the small coded ledger. "Because we also have this. A full confession of sorts. Samuel Henderson's final words, detailing years of extortion and corruption, all leading back to you, Mr. Croft. And you, Supervisor Blake." Martha Wilson had found the ledger in the storm cellar. She had gotten it to Tom just before he rode out. He had found not only the marshal but Elias, who had been found downstream by a trapper and was slowly recovering, trying to find a way to get word to the law. It was over. The trap had been sprung. The marshal's men moved in, clapping irons on a sputtering Harrison Blake and a raging Silas Croft. The courtroom was in chaos. Through it all, Judge Morrison sat on the bench, his face a mask of cold fury. He banged his gavel, the sound cutting through the noise like a gunshot. "Order!" he commanded. "Order in the court!" When the room was silent, he looked at the arrested men, then at Elias, then at me and the 6 children huddled together. A long, thoughtful moment passed. Finally he looked at me, a glimmer of something like awe in his eyes. "Well, Miss Sullivan," he said, his voice ringing with authority, "it appears the matter of your guardianship is the simplest, most just, and most correct decision I will have the honor of making today." The weight of the world lifted from my shoulders. I looked at the children. James was looking at me, his eyes shining with tears of relief and gratitude. Emma was hugging the twins. Sarah was actually smiling. We had won. Justice, true and real, had come to Cedar Falls. Judge Morrison, true to his word, made the guardianship official before the sunset that day. As we left the courthouse, free from the shadow of Blake and Croft, Elias Henderson, Uncle Elias, as the children immediately began to call him, threw a supportive arm around my shoulder. He had lost a brother, but he had found a family, and he was staying. The Henderson farm, which had been a place of fear and sorrow, became a home again. With Elias's help and Tom Wilson's guidance, we brought in the harvest. The work was hard, but our spirits were light. The sound of children's laughter, real, carefree laughter, returned to the fields and the farmhouse. We weren't just a collection of survivors anymore. We were a family forged in tragedy and bound by love and courage. I had come to Iowa seeking a husband and a quiet life. Instead, I had found a battle to fight, a conspiracy to unravel, and 6 children who had become my entire world. I had found my purpose. I had found my home. This story of how a mail-order bride and 6 orphans took down a corrupt system and reclaimed their future is a testament to the fact that family isn't about blood. It's about who you fight for. If you were moved by this story of courage and justice, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We have a story for you tomorrow that you absolutely will not want to miss. Turn on that notification bell and we'll see you then.